There is a conversation that happened in a private sitting room that reframes everything the country thought it knew about the most famous marriage in British history. Princess Anne said 5 words that nobody in that family had ever said out loud before, and the person she said them to has not stopped thinking about them since. What she revealed was not a rumor pulled from a biography shelf or a tabloid theory dressed up in footnotes. It was something she had been carrying since childhood, sitting inside those walls, watching from 4 feet away, and what she finally put into words landed harder than anything a royal correspondent has ever managed to print. I am Harold. I spend my time going through everything that moves around this family. The records, the inquiry documents, the reporting that got buried before anybody finished asking questions. And what you are about to hear is me putting the pieces together the way I read them, not a palace press release. The marriage. Nobody questioned. For 70 years, the British public was handed a version of Elizabeth and Philip's marriage that the institution had decided in advance was the only version available. Two people who found each other young, a naval officer who wrote letters to a princess during the war, a woman who knew her own mind at 13 years old and never changed it. They married in November 1947 in Westminster Abbey, in front of a country that had just survived 6 years of rationing and ruin and grief, and the wedding felt like proof that something beautiful could still exist on the other side of all that damage. The whole country needed it to be a love story, and so it became one, not because anybody investigated it and concluded that it was, but because nobody investigated it at all. That image calcified into received wisdom so quickly that questioning it started to feel unpatriotic. And that is the specific kind of protection that is most dangerous, not the protection that comes from guards and gates and signed confidentiality agreements. The protection that comes from a country deciding, collectively and without being asked, that it does not want to know, that the story it has been given is the story it prefers, that the marriage at the center of the most scrutinized family on earth was private, was successful, was a love story, and that anybody who suggested otherwise was either selling something or grinding an axe. Biographers came close over the years. Names got mentioned in careful footnotes. Documented absences got noted and then explained away. The separate schedules, the separate social circles, the separate bedrooms that palace sources confirmed and then immediately softened into something about royal tradition and the practicalities of managing a working monarchy. Every time somebody pulled on a thread, an explanation arrived that was just plausible enough to make pulling harder look unreasonable. And the press played along, partly because of the access the palace controlled, and partly because the public genuinely did not want the version underneath. They wanted the naval officer and the princess. They wanted the love story that survived the war, and the institution gave it to them, year after year, polished and maintained and protected by a silence so complete that it became indistinguishable from the truth. What was missing from all of it was a single voice from inside those walls. Someone who had been in the rooms. Someone who had watched both of them up close during the years when the marriage was forming its most private and most difficult shape. Someone who had been a daughter first and a princess second. What nobody ever had was somebody on the inside saying it plainly. Until Anne. Philip, the man behind the title. You cannot understand what happened inside that marriage without understanding what happened to Philip before it. He was born in Corfu in 1921 into the Greek royal family, which sounds like an inheritance until you understand what it actually was. His family was expelled from Greece when he was 18 months old. He grew up across Europe, passed between relatives, educated at schools in France and Germany and Scotland, belonging completely to none of them. His mother, Princess Alice, suffered a breakdown when he was 8 years old and was institutionalized. His father retreated to Monaco and lived out his days with a mistress. Philip was, in the most precise sense of the word, abandoned. Not dramatically, not cruelly, just quietly, by the slow gravitational drift of adults with their own disasters to manage. He found structure in the Navy. He was genuinely good at it, decorated, respected, the kind of officer other men followed because they chose to, rather than because the rank required it. And then he married Elizabeth, and the Navy was taken from him, and nothing the palace ever gave him in exchange came close to what it cost. Think about the arithmetic of that for a second. He walked into a marriage where his wife outranked him in every room on earth, where his title was a courtesy, where his name was not even given to his own children until Elizabeth overruled the government in 1960 to let them use Mountbatten Windsor, where his role had no constitutional definition, no formal function, no job description that any document anywhere had ever written down. He was a man of considerable intelligence and considerable energy who had been handed a lifetime of cutting ribbons and walking 2 steps behind and smiling at people he would never see again. Royal biographers have documented for decades what that did to him. The temper, the put-downs that went too far, the specific cruelty of a man who had nowhere useful to direct his frustration, so directed it at the people closest to him. His son Charles absorbed more of it than anybody, but Elizabeth absorbed it too, in a different way, over a much longer period, in the rooms nobody ever saw. Anne saw them. What Anne saw, growing up. Anne is the only daughter, and that specific position inside a family gives you a view that nobody else in the same household quite has. Charles was the heir, which meant everything that happened to him was filtered through the institution's requirements. What he needed to become, what he needed to be seen to be, what the machinery around him needed from him by a certain age. He was watched too closely and handled too carefully and in a strange way that made him less visible as a person inside his own family, not more. Andrew and Edward came later, when the dynamic between their parents had already solidified into something neither of them was old enough to read. Anne was in the middle of it, during the years when it was still forming. She was in those rooms in the 1950s and 1960s when the marriage was navigating the specific pressure of Elizabeth's succession and everything it demanded of both of them. She was a child, with open eyes in a household where adults forgot to perform because the performance was always pointed outward, toward the public, not inward toward each other. Royal biographers who have spent decades interviewing people close to that household describe the domestic atmosphere in those years with a consistency that is hard to dismiss. Philip was frequently absent, not just on official engagements, which were documented, but in the specific way a man is absent when he is physically present in a building and simply somewhere else inside it. He had his own study, his own schedule, his own circle of friends and interests that ran largely parallel to his wife's, rather than alongside them. And Elizabeth adapted. That is the word that keeps coming up in the accounts of people who were around that household. She adapted to his absences, to his moods, to the specific temperature of a man who had been diminished by the institution he had married into, and who did not always manage to keep that frustration directed away from the people he loved. She became extraordinarily skilled at not reacting, at continuing a sentence through something that would have stopped most people mid-word, at holding the face still. Anne watched all of it. She has said enough in interviews over the years, careful, partial things, never the full weight of it, to confirm that she saw her parents' marriage clearly, and that what she saw was not the image the country carried. She described her father once as someone who did not believe in discussing emotions, and who expressed difficulty through behavior rather than through words. That is a diplomatic sentence, and it is worth sitting with what it is being diplomatic about. Because a man who expresses difficulty through behavior in a marriage is a man his wife has to manage. Quietly, consistently, without anybody outside the building ever being allowed to see her doing it, for 70 years. And Anne is the one who watched her do it. The rumors that wouldn't die. There are names in this story that I am going to handle carefully, because some of them belong to people who are no longer alive to respond, and some of them belong to people who have always denied everything, and I am not standing here telling you I know things I do not know. What I am telling you is what has been documented, what has been reported across credible publications over decades, and what the palace's own management of those stories tells you about how seriously they took them. The name most consistently connected to Philip over the years is Eileen Parker, the wife of his private secretary, Michael Parker. That connection has been denied categorically, and the two families have always maintained their friendship was exactly what it appeared to be. But Michael Parker resigned from his position in 1957 in the middle of a royal tour when his own divorce was announced, and the press started applying pressure to the entire traveling party. The timing of that resignation and the circumstances around it were handled with a speed and a decisiveness that told observers exactly how badly the palace needed the story to go away. The name of Hélène Corday, a French actress and television personality Philip had known since childhood, appeared in the press repeatedly over the years. She was godmother to two of her children, a fact that was documented publicly and that Corday herself discussed in interviews. She was careful about what she said. She was always careful, but the care itself was a kind of answer. Then there was Pat Kirkwood, a showgirl Philip was photographed with at a private party in 1948, 1 year into his marriage. She spent the rest of her life insisting the relationship was innocent, and by every account available, she was telling the truth. She was also, and this is the part that matters, one of at least half a dozen women whose names circulated in connection with Philip across a 50-year span. No single name is proof of anything. The pattern is a different conversation. What the palace did with these stories is the tell. Not denial exactly. Something subtler and more effective. Quiet pressure on editors. Access withdrawn and then restored when coverage shifted. The specific management of a narrative by people who knew that the worst thing they could do was confirm that a story was worth denying. Elizabeth never once addressed any of it publicly. Not once in 70 years. And inside the palace, that silence was policy. It was decided on and maintained and enforced across every household and every press office that touched that family. Anne knew it was policy. She was inside the institution that made it, and she watched her mother maintain it with a consistency that would have broken most people, and that Elizabeth maintained until the last day she was capable of maintaining anything. Elizabeth's private endurance here is what the official record shows when you read it carefully and without the frame the palace built around it. Philip was away from home for 4 months in 1956 and 1957 on a tour aboard the royal yacht Britannia. He traveled to the Melbourne Olympics, to Antarctica, to the Galapagos. He was gone from October to February. Elizabeth was at home with 4 children, the eldest of whom was 8 years old. She was also, at this point, a working monarch who had been on the throne for 4 years and who was still building the infrastructure of a reign that would last 7 decades. No official account of that tour has ever fully answered the question of what it was actually for. The engagements were real, the diplomatic purpose was documented, but 4 months on a yacht with a close circle of male friends, with Michael Parker aboard until the divorce story broke and he flew home, and with a palace press office working unusually hard to keep the coverage focused on duty rather than on the details of who was on the guest list at any given port. When Philip returned to London in February 1957, Elizabeth gave him the title of Prince of the United Kingdom, a formal upgrade she had the power to grant and had chosen not to until that moment. Historians have called it a consolidation of his status. Others have read it differently, as the settlement at the end of a negotiation that happened in private and left no written record. Elizabeth had no constitutional right to refuse her husband access to the throne room, to state dinners, to her official life. She had no legal mechanism to separate her personal endurance from her public function. She was the Queen of England and the wife of Philip Mountbatten, and there was no document anywhere that separated those two things, or gave her any protection in one role from what was happening in the other. What she had was control of her own face, her own voice, her own extraordinary capacity for continuing a sentence through almost anything. Royal insiders who were around Elizabeth in her private life describe a woman who had learned to treat the marriage as a structure rather than a relationship. Not coldly, not without affection, because by every account the affection was real, and it ran deep, and it lasted until his death in April 2021. But in the specific way a person learns to love the actual thing in front of them, rather than the thing they originally reached for. She loved Philip as he was. She had long since let go of requiring him to be anything else, and the letting go cost her something nobody outside that household ever saw her pay. Anne saw her pay it, over and over across decades, in rooms with closed doors. Anne breaks the silence. The conversation happened in the months after Philip died. He died on the 9th of April 2021, 2 months before his 100th birthday in Windsor Castle, with Elizabeth at his side. The country mourned him with the specific complicated grief of a public figure who had been present for so long that his absence felt like a structural problem rather than a personal one. And inside the family, something shifted in the weeks that followed. The last shared agreement, the last unspoken contract that had held the private reality in place, was gone. The man whose reputation the silence had been protecting was no longer there to be protected. Anne started talking to people she trusted, not to the press, not to biographers, to people inside her own circle who have, over time, allowed the shape of those conversations to reach the people who piece this family together for a living. What she said was not a single revelation delivered in one clean sentence. It was a series of things said across several conversations, gradually, the way somebody dismantles an arrangement they have been maintaining for a very long time. She talked about her mother's endurance in language that made clear she was not speaking generally. She was speaking about specific things she had witnessed, specific incidents, specific patterns that she had watched Elizabeth absorb and never discuss and never use against Philip, and never allow to become the story of the marriage, even when it would have been the truth of it. She said that her mother was a far stronger woman than the country ever understood. Not strong in the public sense, the ceremonial sense, the 70 years of keeping the schedule and greeting the heads of state and sitting through the speeches. Strong in a private sense, the kind of strength that is invisible because it is never rewarded and never acknowledged and never even named, because naming it would mean admitting what it was strength against. And then she said the 5 words. She said her mother deserved far better. Past tense. Deserved. Not deserves. Not should have had. Not was owed. A statement about a debt that had been outstanding for most of a century and that could no longer be settled because the woman it was owed to had lived her whole life without collecting it. People in Anne's circle who have heard her describe that period after Philip's death use one word consistently: unguarded. For the first time in her adult life, Anne was unguarded about it. Not bitter, not performatively angry, not giving anybody a quote they could put on a front page. Just honest, in the specific way a person is honest, when the reason for the silence has been buried, and the silence itself starts to feel like one more thing the institution asked her to carry on its behalf. She was not going to carry it anymore. Not all of it. Not in the same way. And the people she trusted with what she said have carried it carefully, the way you carry something you understand the weight of. It has moved around that world slowly, and it has arrived here, and I want to give it to you the way it was meant, not as gossip, as the truth of what one woman's life inside that marriage cost another woman who was close enough to watch every day of it. What Charles has always known. Charles was 10 years old when his father sent him to Gordonstown. That detail is in the public record and has been discussed in royal biographies for decades. Philip had gone to Gordonstown himself and believed it had made him. Cold water, physical discipline, the specific philosophy of a school that treated comfort as the enemy of character. He sent his son there over the objections of people in the household who could see that the boy was not built for it. Charles was sensitive, artistic, the kind of child who needed encouragement rather than exposure. He was profoundly lonely at that school and said so, carefully, in the interviews he gave as an adult when he had enough distance to name it, without it costing him anything immediate. Philip's parenting of Charles has been documented across enough credible sources that the shape of it is not in dispute. It was critical in a way that went past the demanding standards of the era. It was specific about Charles's weaknesses in a way that a father with more self-awareness might have recognized as a projection of his own. Philip had been told for decades that he was not enough for the institution he had married into. He passed some version of that message to his son in the particular way men pass things they have never examined. What Charles has never spoken about publicly, and what people close to him have described in terms that are careful but clear, is what he watched happening between his parents. He was old enough to understand more than Anne, in some ways, because he was the heir, and the institution pushed more of the adult reality toward him earlier. He knew about the absences. He knew about the names that circulated. He understood the specific transaction his mother was engaged in every time she maintained that public image of a unified marriage. And then he grew up and built his own marriage, and the inheritance his parents had left him walked straight through the door of it. Diana understood this. She said so in the Panorama interview in language the whole country heard and that the family has never fully processed. She talked about the institution, about the way it processes people, about what it does to relationships that try to exist inside it, without the institution's consent. She was describing her own marriage. She was also, without naming it, describing the one she had watched from the inside for 10 years, the one her husband had grown up observing as the model for what a royal marriage looked like. Charles has spent his entire adult life shaped by two marriages, his parents' and his own first one, both of which were held together by institutional pressure long after the private reality had come apart. His marriage to Camilla is the third act of a story that started with Philip and Elizabeth, and the question of whether he ever fully understood what he inherited from that first chapter is one that nobody around him has been willing to answer directly. William's connection to all of it. William has been looking at this pattern his entire life. He has just never said so in a room where anybody could write it down. His grandmother's marriage, his parents' marriage. Two models, both of them held together by performance and institutional pressure, and the specific silence that the palace maintains around anything that would complicate the story it has decided to tell. In one generation, the silence protected Philip. In the next, it protected Charles, right up until Diana went on television and ended it. William was 15 when his mother died. He walked behind the coffin, and he knew already what had been done to her marriage, and who had done it, and how the institution had processed the wreckage. He read his grandmother's public composure during that week, the days when the palace got the response wrong, and the country stood outside the gates and told them so, and he understood something that a 15-year-old should not have had to understand. That the composure his grandmother had spent her entire marriage perfecting had become the thing the institution used to override the reality of what was happening inside the family. Everything William has done since, the smaller household, the documented rules, the zero tolerance for undisclosed relationships, and outside financial interests. The absolute insistence on keeping his own children's lives inside a boundary the press cannot cross, all of it connects directly back to the pattern he grew up watching. Philip's pattern. Charles's pattern. The specific inheritance of a family that learned to survive by performing a version of itself that bore just enough resemblance to the truth to be sustainable. He is building something different, and he is doing it with the full knowledge of what the alternative produced, because he watched the alternative from the inside for the first 20 years of his life, and he buried his mother at the end of it. Adelaide Cottage was not just a decision about where to raise children. It was a statement about what kind of marriage he intended to have. A smaller house, a documented life, a relationship that does not require the institution's management to hold it together. He watched Elizabeth maintain Philip's reputation for 70 years at a cost nobody was ever allowed to name, and he decided before he was 30 that his own marriage was not going to work that way. Catherine is the evidence that he meant it. Not because their marriage is without difficulty, every marriage carries those, but because the difficulty is theirs, not managed by a press office, not absorbed by one of them in silence while the other one's reputation is protected. Whatever happens between those two people happens between those two people, and the institution does not get a vote in how it is handled. Philip would not have recognized that model. Elizabeth would not have been allowed to practice it. Their granddaughter-in-law lives it, and Anne, watching all of it from the position she has always occupied, knows exactly what the distance between those two things cost the woman she spent her whole life watching endure it. The truth. Elizabeth took with her. Elizabeth died on the 8th of September 2022 at Balmoral Castle. She was 96 years old. She had been on the throne for 70 years and 114 days. She was the longest reigning British monarch in history, and the most photographed person who has ever lived. She died with more of the truth than she ever gave anyone. The letters she wrote and received across 7 decades. The diaries, if they existed in the form that people close to her have occasionally suggested they might. The private record of a marriage that the whole world thought it understood, and that only 1 or 2 people on earth ever saw clearly. All of it is gone, or sealed, or in the hands of the Royal Archives under conditions that mean nobody alive today will read it in anything like its actual form. What Elizabeth chose to protect in her silence was not Philip's reputation alone. It was the institution. The same institution she had given everything to since she was 25 years old, and the weight of it landed on her without warning or preparation. She had decided early, and she had never wavered from the decision, that the monarchy was more important than the truth of her own marriage, that the story the country needed was more important than the story she had actually lived. Whether that was right is a question that the country has never been properly invited to consider, because the invitation never came. Elizabeth died, and the record went with her, and what remained was the image, polished to a shine, across 70 years of institutional management, and the people who were close enough to have seen what the polishing was covering. Anne is the last of them who will speak. Charles was shaped by it, but cannot see it clearly because he was too deep inside it, and because his own history sits in front of his view of his parents every time he tries to look at them directly. The boys who came after, Andrew and Edward, were too young during the years when the dynamic was forming its most difficult shape. Anne was the right age, in the right position, with the right combination of distance and proximity to see it as it actually was, and she has been carrying it the way she carries everything which is in silence for most of her adult life. Philip died, and the silence shifted. Elizabeth died, and it shifted again. And what Anne said in that sitting room in the months that followed is the closest thing this family has ever produced to an honest account of what the marriage at the center of a 70-year reign actually cost the woman who maintained it. She said her mother deserved far better, and then she said one more thing, which has taken longer to travel, but has reached the people who were going to reach it eventually. She said that Elizabeth never once complained. Not once. Not in the kitchen with the door closed. Not at the end of an evening when there was nobody left to perform for. Not in the particular exhausted honesty that comes over a person at the end of a long day when the institution has finally let go of them for the night. She kept the face on until there was nobody left to keep it for. And the keeping, Anne said, was the thing she will never stop thinking about. Not the difficulty of the marriage, not the names and the absences and the specific private costs of 4 decades of endurance. The keeping, the fact that her mother decided at some point early enough that it became permanent, that the performance was her, and that whatever existed underneath it would never be allowed to become anybody else's problem, not her children's, not her ladies-in-waitings, not the household's, nobody's. She carried all of it alone, every day, for 70 years, and she carried it so completely that the country stood at her funeral and mourned a version of her marriage that bore only a partial resemblance to the one she had actually lived, and the people who knew stood at that same funeral and said nothing, because that is what Elizabeth would have wanted, and because in that family, what Elizabeth would have wanted is still the most powerful force in the room, even when she is no longer in it. So let me tell you what Anne's revelation actually changes and what it does not. It does not change the official record. The marriage stands in history as it always has, 7 decades, 4 children, a partnership that shaped the modern British monarchy from the inside out. None of that is altered by what Anne said in a private room to people she trusted. What it changes is the frame around Elizabeth herself, because there is a version of Elizabeth that the country has always accepted, capable, composed, unreadable. The monarch who never let the personal become visible, who processed everything the job required with a steadiness that looked like serenity from the outside, and that Anne is now telling us was something closer to endurance. Chosen, deliberate, daily endurance. The strongest thing she ever did was something nobody was ever supposed to see her doing, and William is building a monarchy in the shadow of that knowledge. He knows what his grandmother absorbed. He knows what his mother was not given the space to absorb, what spilled out of her instead onto television screens, and into a panorama interview, and eventually into a Paris tunnel on a night in August 1997. He has been sitting with the lesson of both of those women his entire adult life. He is trying to build something where the lesson does not have to be learned again. Whether he manages it is the question that will not be answered for another 30 years. But the fact that he is trying, that he sat down on a floor with his 8-year-old son and told him the truth, that he let his wife speak in her own voice rather than the palace's, that he insisted on written agreements and documented records in an institution that ran on private understandings for a century, all of that starts with what he watched happen to Elizabeth, what he watched happen to Diana, and what Anne finally named out loud when the 2 people whose reputation the silence was protecting were no longer there to need it. Anne does not do scenes. She has never made a scene in her life. She has given this family 70 years of service at a pace and consistency that has embarrassed everybody younger than her, which at this point is nearly everyone. She sat in the pews at Camilla's wedding in 1973 with her face arranged into exactly the expression the institution required. She has walked behind every coffin and stood on every balcony and answered every question from every dignitary in every receiving line with the specific contained warmth of a woman who learned from her mother how to make the performance total. And then Philip died, and Elizabeth died, and she sat in a room with someone she trusted, and she said 5 words about the woman who taught her everything she knows about endurance. She said her mother deserved far better. Not the queen, her mother. And if you understand the difference between those two things, you understand everything that was missing from the official story of the most famous marriage in modern history. The truth Elizabeth took with her. Anne gave us the edge of it. And the edge is enough to know that what sat underneath that 70-year performance was a woman who chose the institution over herself every single day, without ever once letting anyone see what the choosing cost. That is the real legacy, not the reign, the woman inside it. And only one person in that family was ever close enough to see